Hello, and welcome to this podcast series celebrating the 30th anniversary of the National Fairground and Circus Archive. In this episode, Arantza talks to Professor Vanessa Toulmin. Vanessa comes from a Lancashire fairground showman family, which is where her passion for popular entertainment stems. She completed her PhD at the University of Sheffield in 1997, inspired by her showman roots, and that same year was awarded the Chancellor's Medal for Outstanding Achievement. In 2007, she was awarded a chair in early film and popular entertainment, making her the first academic to be given a personal chair in this subject in any university. Professor Toulmin established the National Fairground Archive at the University of Sheffield Library in 1994 with the support of the university's Vice-Chancellor, the Showmen's Guild of Great Britain and the Fairground Association of Great Britain. Under her direction, the archive has developed into a major international research resource on the history of popular entertainment. Professor Toulmin is a leading authority on Victorian entertainment, New Variety, circus and film, and has completed extensive research on travelling show people. She was also a creative advisor to festivals in the United Kingdom, including the Roundhouse in London, Showzam in Blackpool, and Circus 250. Professor Toulmin has acted as historical consultant for 7 major television productions since 2000. Including the Mitchell and Kenyon series on BBC Two, and has co-produced 5 major radio programmes with BBC Radio 4 on popular entertainment, history of fairs and early cinema. She worked with BBC 4 Time Shift, producing 2 programmes on the history of fairs and circuses, and has also appeared on Who Do You Think You Are and The Real History of Britain with Melvyn Bragg. Professor Toulmin is the author of several key works on popular entertainment, including The Lost World of Mitchell and Kenyon, Electric Edwardians, and Pleasurelands.
Vanessa, can you tell us how this archive was established?
The Fairground Archive, or as it was called at the time, the National Fairground Archive, was really a concept. It wasn't really an identity or a collection. It was just a concept. It started because I was doing my PhD on the history of travelling show people. My family are 5th generation show people, but I was born on the seaside, so technically we're sand dancers, not show people, both. And my uncle died, my Uncle Arthur, who ran a fair in Wales. I loved him very dearly. He was completely mad. And I went and did my PhD because I'd been travelling all over working, and I realised that I had an amazing history in front of me. So I just started doing my PhD. I got a Wingate scholarship and various scholarships, and then was collecting material that show people were giving me all over. And I was at a Fairground Association meeting, Cambridge, about a collection, and Cambridge University were interested in it. And I said, well, if you put it at Cambridge, it will never get out, because, you know, there's a very strict protocol of people going to see it. I said, well, I'll talk to the university. So suddenly this idea of a fairground archive came out, and then I approached the library. My old dear Professor Norman Blake, who was my head of department, contacted the library and said, yeah. And at the same, so it was made up of 3 collections. In that first instance, it was made up of the Fairground Association collection, which is one of the photographers who took lots of photographs. Then it was the World's Fair. So the World's Fair, I needed access to the World's Fair to do my PhD. So the showman agreed that I could have the World's Fair copies in their cellars. That was an interesting story. And then there was this other collection, which was the Shufflebottom collection. So the kernel of the 3 concepts of the showman, the enthusiast, and the, what I would say is the kind of legitimate business side. So the World's Fair was the business, it was also family, but the World's Fair is the official record of the business in a way. Then the Showman's family, which is the Florence Shufflebottom collection, wasn't actually Florence, it was the Margaret Bird collection at the time. And then I would say the Fairground Association, which was the Jack Leeson collection. So those 3 collections became the archive.
Vanessa, how did you get the first collections donated?
When the collections came to the archive, it wasn't a collection. I learned all this when I set up the archive. I wasn't an archivist, I wasn't a librarian. I knew collectors, because I'd worked with collectors for years. It really was what, going back to Henry Morley on the Bartholomew Fair, the unwritten story of the history of the people, or the unwritten history of the story of the people. That's what fairs are. And everybody has this old concept of an oral tradition, but show people keep things because you need to prove your existence. You know, I'd grown up with photographs and images, or my family would say we went here and we did this, and I had a lot of collection. I had a lot of material in my PhD. So how did I get the stuff? Well, I literally worked on the fairs. We have an expression on the fairground called mung chavvy mung, which means getting something for nothing. I'm very good at it. I've spent my life mung chavvy munging in everything I've ever done, so I just applied that back. So you would sit with the show people, you sit with the older people, you sit with them and talk about their lives, talk about what they've done. Then they suddenly bring out a box of photographs from the belly truck and go, oh, do you want these? So, you know, fair dues to Arantza and the team. They probably had to reformalise 30 years or 20 years of collecting. But you don't sit in an office and wait for stuff to come. You do now, because it's established. And it's recognised. And at the time, we were like not recognised. But we weren't a museum. And that was really quickly. It was about ephemera. It was about archive. It was not about objects. And I think lots of people get taken away with the kind of splendour of the fairground rides. And there was the Fairground Heritage Trust, who had an archive. Well, they're just the mechanical objects that carry on. They don't tell the story of the people. They don't tell you how you build it up or pull it down. They don't tell you that actually you've got rid of like 100 years of steps paint there. You've just varnished it, but not realised that people have been standing on that waltzer for 80 years. That's the history. That is the story, or the relationship between the people and the fair. Why do fairs continue? As a historian, it's because they are there for the people. And if you could have a fair, I always used to say, you have a stall, it's a market. You have a ride, it's an amusement park. You have a show, it's a theatre. You bring those 3 together and you get a fair. And that's what brings it together. So I would literally collect whatever people gave me. There wasn't a collection policy. I don't think I wrote one for 10 years. I think I was forced to by the librarian who sat me down and made me write a collection policy. I think Arantza did the original final one, which she had to go through my pile of like inarticulate, we want this, into a proper policy.
So collection policy is a document that explains what you collect and all the parameters within the collections that can be geographical, thematic, dates.
I would say the reason why I objected for many years to a collection policy, because defining what the collection policy is would then define what you collected, and I didn't want anyone to stop me. And I also felt I understood as an academic, and this is a very young subject at the time. People have preconceptions of what a fair is. Even you will have a preconception, but I could say to you, the very first cinema started on the fair. Circus was very much part of it. Acrobatic tradition, everything, all the first. Electricity, most people would have seen their first electric light by going to a fair. So innovation and technology. The first motor car people would have ridden on would have been on the switchback ride. So the fair is permeated throughout everyone's childhood, adolescence, teenage years. And I remember Sandra, one of the faith priests, my very dear friend Sandra, right, Marshall, very old circus, fairground family, basically saying, you're 3 generations, you go to the fair as a member of the public as a child, you go on your first ride. Then you go as a teenager, and then you get your first kiss, and then you go as a grandparent. And I thought that was a beautiful way of surmising it, you know, the audience for the fair. If you didn't have the people, the public didn't come to the fair, there wouldn't be a fair. So I see the fair as a cradle of illegitimate activity, and I mean in terms of academia, illegitimate entertainment, that entertainment before it forgets a home. So it kind of travels with the fair, then gets its own home. So magic got its own home with the Egyptian Hall. Cinematograph got its own home with cinemas. Rides got their own home with amusement parks. But the fair still continues. So that, to me, the archive should be a living archive to reflect the dynamics of that ever-growing tradition.
What is the significance of the collections?
I remember the significance on the collection on the very first inauguration, and I never forgot it because I myself had become blinded by it. On the very first day, when Anthony Harris, who was the president of the Showmen's Guild, stood up and welcomed me to the stage, because at the time I was a lowly postgrad in the university, you don't go on the stage with the Vice-Chancellor, basically said, this is a really important time for the Showmen because this is now we're being recognised. We are now legitimate because we're in a university. And that's when I realised the significance of the collection, because in a way, the collection was their own identity. I've been to numerous dinners and lunches and parliamentary committees, and the show people will say, but we've got our own archive. They never called it the National Fairground Archive. They just used to get letters to the Fairground Showman's Archive, Sheffield. I always used to love the fact that they got to us. The community aspect was really important to me because it was about the community, but it was a legitimisation. And until you're born on a fair, until, you know, show people are not, we're not a racial identity, we're not an ethnic identity, but this last census we're a cultural identity. And I was really emotional to write showwoman down on the census. It was really emotional for me that I could put down my own identity. And I still identify that, you know, ultimately I am a showwoman. That is what I am. And I think that permeates what I put into the collection, that identity. And so to me, the significance of the collection is that it has given an identity culturally and academically, structurally, to a community that has never had recognition for their contribution towards popular culture in the United Kingdom and Europe. Somebody wants to build a supermarket on a fairground site, they come to the archive to prove that that was a fair. Somebody wants to kind of build houses on a meadow. Well, the fair's rights. Well, what are fair's rights? Well, it goes back to the 12th century. That's in the archive. But having it central, having it brought together alongside what was on the fair, centralisation, I suppose, is the significance. Because I could say that all of those parts were elsewhere. But now there's a record of bringing those together and having trained staff who can help people on that journey. What I didn't envisage it would be was a collection for family historians. I would say that the archive, even now, is the easiest collection in any university to get into because the staff are trained and know that. But you don't have to have a reading card. You don't have to do this. You can just walk in. You can just make an appointment. You can just ring up. And the team are amazing at dealing with people who've never used collections before. It's lovely to be back with the collections because obviously I spent 20 odd years with many of these things. And when Arantza asked me to choose, it was really difficult. It's like choosing your favourite child. So I chose the ones here because they were significant departures or significant interventions in terms of collection material. When I mean intervention, I mean it actually increased both the scholastic range of material and the research range, and also showed that it's an academic word, intermediality. All mediums have interdisciplinary approaches, and in academia we call it intermedial. So the magic lantern is related to the cinema, and the cinema is related to projection, and projection is related to magic. So the intermediality of collections is really important to me. That it's just like, where's the overlap? Where do they come from? Where do they collect together? So the Shuffle Bottom collection was perfect. One, because it was amazing. So the Shuffle Bottom collection was the first collection. The first Showman's collection, Show Family collection, but also, importantly, it was told from the woman's viewpoint, and a third of my PhD was about show women, and I'm from a long line. But what was really interesting, it comprises of 3 or 4 different family members now, So it's not just Margaret Bird, it's Florence Shufflebottom and it's other family members. But really it personified by two women, Margaret Bird, who was one of the original members of the Shufflebottom family. So the Shufflebottom family were a family of Wild West performers. So immediately, and then you have two areas. You have the Fairground show, you have the Shufflebottom family who claimed that they were from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which is rubbish, with a name like Shufflebottom, they're from Lancashire. And then you have this incredible four generations of a family doing Wild West shows on the fairground. Representations of the Wild West in four different generations. So one generation's like Annie Oakley, Doris Day, Calamity Jane. The previous generation's like John Wayne in the 1930s. And then the 1890s generation's Buffalo Bill Cody. So the West in American history is the history of America. So you suddenly got this incredible collection through British eyes. And it was bizarre. So everyone knows about the European Western, but they don't know about the British. So you suddenly had this avenue through this family. And I always remember Florence saying to me when she was doing the costume, and it's my favourite aspect, where there she is, there's Florence with her son Gary, who's still alive, Gary Campbell, and that's Florence Shufflebottom, and I loved her dearly. She was a wonderful lady. And her grandfather was Texas Bill Shufflebottom. And Florence used to pretend, she was like Yorkshire's answer to Annie Oakley. And she would tell me the story that her father used to dress them in leathers and all the things like you see in the John Wayne films on the 30s. And then she went to see Annie Get Your Gun. And she wanted to dress in velvet. So she made a costume and her father said to her, "But Florence, real cowboys don't wear velvet." And she said, "I didn't have the heart to say to him, we're not real cowboys." So Florence is wearing a very, very beautiful costume, which is velvet, because she told me. She's got a rifle in her hand. And when she dies, her funeral song was, "You Can't Get a Man with a Gun," from Annie Oakley, which was beautiful. She got a really beautiful, extravagantly beaded waistcoat. Obviously, they wouldn't have worn that in America, but the American West is a myth as it happens. So the Wild West show is a myth. But what's fascinating, and this is Florence's father, Richard Shufflebottom, and then you've got, so he was many children, and there's the original Texas Bill Shufflebottom and his wife, who was from a circus family. So there you get the connection with the circus. So the Shufflebottoms were also circus performers. So suddenly the connection between the fair and the circus is there in one family. And that's Florence with her grandmother, and her mother were snake charmers. So there's a fantastic photograph of Florence's mother with a snake wrapped around her when she was a baby. And Florence had two snakes, and she told me all about them. So she was an incredible snake charmer. And this is one of the shows. And then there was 4 Shufflebottom shows, because there was 4 sons. So all of them had shows. So Wally had a show. So all of the 4 boys had shows. Ben had a show, Richard had a show. So the collection is a mixture of the Bird family, who were the daughter, she was one of the daughters of Texas Bill, and Florence, who was the granddaughter.
Speaking about shows, what about the Bramwell Taylor collection?
Well, the Bramwell Taylor collection was probably the first one that was so definitely linked into my own academic area. This is important because this was the first collection we bought. We actually acquired it. John Bramwell Taylor, who was a clerk at the club in London, the Savage Club, and he collected paper. When he died, 2 van loads of paper were taken out of his flat. 2 van loads. And it was all left to this collector, this dealer. And he said, "Oh, I've got loads." I said, "Well, would you give me a price for all of it?" So he said, "Yeah, okay." So he gave me a price. At the time, we didn't even have a budget or an acquisition budget. So I went to the university and I said, "Well, I'll fundraise," and half and half. So basically people sponsored it. So the Fairground Association sponsored all the stuff that was related to fairs. The Circus Friends Association gave a donation for all the circus material. Then other people, collectors I knew, sponsored it. So we raised the money before crowdfunder. And ultimately, I bought the collection for less than £30 an item. He bought it into the collection, John, the dealer. He bought it in, and the day before, because this is very early eBay days, one of the handbills in the collection and got on eBay. Not this collection, but a similar one for £680. And I thought, has he seen it? Is he going to say something to me? And he said, yeah, I know, Vanessa. He said, but, you know, this will pay for my son's private school fees this year. And I'd rather it went to a good home, but can you make sure you remember John's name? And I said, yeah, we will. And then he gave us all the other stuff to do with it.
Was he originally from Sheffield?
Yeah, and he was originally from Sheffield, yeah. So in a way, he was glad it had come back. I mean, there's a PhD in every folder. But this one here, Grand Central Railway, a waxwork. So suddenly you've got the waxwork tradition, and then you've got the mechanical rides, and you've got the prototype. So, and it really is 1800s, early 1800s to 1850s. So it's before the Great Exhibition. This is at the same time as the great arcades. This is the consumer society being born here in this collection, because it's got things for sale. You know, it's got, you know, a cast iron bell, Duval's tableaus, but it's by street. So this is Piccadilly, right? So this is Venus again. And then this is Chang, the Chinese giant. And then you've got the most incredible first appearance of Tom Thumb in England with P.T. Barnum. First appearance of Tom Thumb, which basically created the life and legend that is P.T. Barnum. Tom Thumb became arguably one of the greatest personalities and stars of the 19th century.
So speaking about great showmen, what about Lord George Sangha?
Yeah, who do you think you are, Lord George Sangha? That's what you used to get told when you were on the fair. If you were a bit cocky or a bit over the top, who do you think you are, Lord George Sangha? Sangha's a fascinating character because in a way he's a bit like Liberty Valance. The myth is greater, or the legend is actually what's in the public domain, but the reality is far more interesting. But getting to that reality is really difficult. So Sangha's really, really important because he was one of the very first great circus showmen. He was from the fair, he was from a fairground family. He was the first president of the Showmen's Guild. And he bridges the years between the 1840s to 1910, which is when legitimisation of circus and entertainment. So he's really significant in that period. What was significant is the Sangha Circus was arguably one of the greatest British circus of the 19th century. And he sold his circus to P.T. Barnum. So you've got this relationship between Barnum, the greatest showman, and Sangha. Sangha was his peer. He was also went to court with Buffalo Bill. So he is that intersection of the American popularisation of what is essentially British entertainment culture. And Sangha's at the centre of it. From the viewpoint of the showman, he's the most famous. He wasn't a lord, but he called himself Lord George Sangha. His brother, Lord John, they had a partnership. They travelled together for many years and had one of the greatest circus shows in the 19th century. So Sangha collection shows you the acts, shows you the performers, and it's 3 different collections. So one of them is a family. We and Andrew went down to Galette. We literally went to London and met this amazing woman who used to design dresses for Shirley Bassey. She gave us those as well. She designed costumes. Her husband was part of, I would say, carefully the London underworld. But she was from the Sangha family. And she was very proud of this heritage. And then we had another collection who was the granddaughter of the vet, who was Sangha's vet. So that collection is more animal-based. And that actually was one of the few collections that just came in the post. I heard you on Radio 4 and I thought you'd be interested in this. So, you know, collections come in different ways. So that one, the shuffle bottoms, I went down to the family on the fair and got it. The Brownwell Taylor, we acquired it. And this one was donated by 3 different family members. And it became a collection over the years because it started with a few items. And then I don't know if they've still got the original collection, DLB, who donated it. But now it's the Sangha collection, isn't it? Then I met somebody who is the grandson of Lord John Sangha with all the letters and correspondence. And that became part of the collection.
what about the significance of printing houses?
Or was it Barnum or Sanger who basically said, before you start the circus, you print the poster? So I actually remember this to the day. I got a phone call from my colleague Amanda, who was in the archive, and a gentleman had just rung up and said he was a member of the Taylor family and they had a printing company. He'd seen me on the telly. So the Taylor family, Taylors of Ronwell, were the most significant printing companies. So in the world of fairs and circuses and entertainment, you've got to have a poster. That's where you advertise. Buffalo Bill was famous for his posters. He would do 20, 40 sheets, and he would not actually put anything other than the picture of his face and say, "I am coming." How you advertise your fair or how you advertise your event is through the poster or through the handbill. With the shows of London, it would be handbills. You see it now. You walk down the road and people are giving you that is tomorrow's history. So with the Taylor family, Charles Taylor, so I went to his house in Ronwell, and literally he had the family archive. Thousands and thousands. So he's like, well, take a whole set. I was like, whole set? Boxes. I think there's about 2,500 posters. And what was really interesting to me, at the time, everyone was obsessed with the 19th century poster, but the 20th century poster was not really collected by people. So I saw it as a really important thing for us to collect 20th century posters, like collect posters of the time, collect posters from the 80s and the 60s and 70s. Most of the most beautiful 19th century posters are the ones that are graphic, which are lithograph. That's a lithograph. That one there, that's a Lynch. That's a Canadian one, right? That's a lithograph. That is a letterpress on a lino. So you've got all these different types of designs. This is straight letterpress, but they also did LIFO and beautiful. And they did these incredible pantomime posters. Now, we don't collect pantomime per se, we might now, but we didn't at the time, because pantomime's always been legitimate. Despite its origins, it's literally a mainstay of theatre. And I don't study panto, there's lots of colleagues who do that. This was more interesting because it was boxing, a working class, and it shows you this transition from variety halls, which were in decline, to working men's clubs in the 60s and 70s. So it showed an interesting transition, but it also showed the types of entertainment, gaiety theatre, the decline of the variety, also showed you the circuses. So the potential for this collection is still immense because it's really the last 50 years of entertainment of the 20th century, which nobody's really looked at. But I always remember when I was in the John Johnson collection, which is the greatest ephemera collection anywhere. It's amazing. I love that collection in the Bodleian. And it's difficult to get to, and I've used it quite a lot. And I knew the curators. I was there with a young scholar called Petta. She was a circus historian. And she said to me, you know what, Vanessa, everyone's collecting 19th century. What are the scholars in 30 years going to do when they want to do 20th century? And I went, yeah, you're right, I should collect 20th century. So it was down to Petta who made me think, because obviously I was an obsessive 19th century. And then we started collecting, and now those very posters, which I got 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and then the CFA archive, we couldn't buy now because they're just astronomical.
Can you tell us about some of the key projects that you've run at the archive while you were director?
Obviously, the fundamental aspect for me when I set up the archives was creating alliances and creating relationships. So, and obviously reflected some of my research interests, because ultimately it's got to be a research collection. We are a university, and I was demonstrating that there was lots of potential for research. So the biggest relationship we had was with the BFI in many ways, which is the Mitchell and Kenyon collection, because that was a film collection, but I knew that it was a collection about exhibition. So Mitchell and Kenyon Film Collection was about films that were exhibited in pre-cinema or venues and spaces, on the fair and the music hall and the variety show. And once you knew where they were exhibited, you could identify the film. But we had the key. The key was the ephemera. See, the Showman has a season. People don't think, they think it's all about, oh, it just happens, right? So fairs start on the February the 14th and finish usually in November. Piers shows start in May or Easter, but not usually Easter because the weather's too bad, but May, finish in September. pantos a certain time. So you can map a calendar of entertainment. So cinema was shown everywhere all through the year, but it moved from different places like a cuckoo in the nest. It laid its egg and went to another nest and then took over, became cinema by 1909. We had the first big AHRC grant for research, to research the Mitchell and Kenyon collection and to do this relationship, and we did a 3-part TV series. I did 178 shows all over the world, and part of my professorship is the Mitchell and Kenyon collection, early film. And it's really significant because it gave us an audience of early film, optical, created a new audience and understanding of what this material was. And PhDs, subsequent PhDs, have come out of that relationship. And today, I still do early film shows, and I am an early film historian, and that relationship. And so Mitchell and Kenyon was really important. I think the second one was the relationship with Blackpool and Marissa Karneski, who became our we got another grant where she was like the AHRC fellow, and we got her archive, and that's a contemporary collection of a performance artist who looks at the kind of queer politics, looks at the kind of performative history. She did Karneski's Ghost Train. She looks at spectacular entertainment and reimagines them. And I think that's really important because that relationship has created a relationship with other women in that area. So that's both physical, like costumes and items, but I think that academic relationship, Marissa then did a PhD, she was an AHRC fellowship, which we were one of the only places who got that. And then I would say admission or classes. All of them, I think the relationship, the two most important ones in many ways, in terms of a museum standard, was the relationship with Sheffield Museums when we did Pleasureland. So we did this massive exhibition on the history of fairs in 2001, and it was only 6 years after the archive was instigated. And we did an exhibition in London, an exhibition in Edinburgh. It was a touring exhibition, it was huge. And then I would say in Circus 2018, when I was no longer running the archive, I came back to the archive with a kind of research proposal for the 250th anniversary of Circus, which kind of the last collection I brought into the archive was the Circus Friends Association collection. You know, the archive has been seen all over the country. It's not just in an archive box, in an archive, in a library, in a university. It's the People's Collection, it's everywhere. And it goes out, it goes to different events, does different shows. And it's, again, that living archive. It brings people together. So I would say having really good academic curatorship, which not just me, other colleagues have done that. Stephen's done that, Brendan's done that. We've had a number of artists who've done significant work with us over the year, from our own Sheffield Pete McKee. So Pete McKee did a series of paintings for us, you know, Mark and Sarah from the Insect Circus, and then obviously the great relationship we have with Anthony Bennett, with the great Omi, the tattooed man. So artists have used the archives for 20, 30 years. Academics have used the archive for 20, 30 years. Institutions have. And at one point, I don't know, in Circus 250, I think the archive was loaning 300 items all over the country. Everyone who was doing a circus exhibition was coming to the archive. And that's brilliant. So, and I think that's important for me in terms of those relationships. The significance of the research collections in terms of the new grant that the archive's got, the significance of it still being a loaning collection, because it's really expensive for local museums to borrow. It's really expensive. And I think the flexibility that the archive gives in loaning stuff is really important. And I think having artists and people use it in different ways. So my legacy, as a way, is that it's still here. The greatest legacy when you set something up is that you can walk away and it still continues.
How would you like to see the archive develop in the future?
I don't think it's really up to me. I think I had a shape and a hand in it for 20 odd years, and I think it's grown and developed without me for the last 10 years. So as long as it has that connection to its community, as long as it always maintains a connection to the fair community. I was a bit sad when it changed its name, not for any other reason that I deliberately called it the National Fairground Archive because it was what was on my grandfather's birth certificate, no fixed abode. you know, and it'll always be NFA to me. And as long as it's always got that essential spirit, I will say what I don't want it to be. I don't want it to be a museum. I don't want it to be a place where people can't see things. I don't want it to be a place where people can't get access. And I don't want it to be something that is only written about by academics. I want it to be what Henry Morley says, the unwritten history of the story of the people, still. And I want it to collect what's happening now. Because, as I said, today's event is tomorrow's history. And it's equally important that you have a poster from Endcliffe Park in Sheffield or Hillsborough Park, that we have something from 100 years ago. Digital, that I'm glad I don't have to cope with that. I'll leave that to the professionals. The issues of digital archiving are just immense, and I'm sorry, I just don't get the same feel as I do when I touch or look at something which is 19th century paper, which should not have existed. You know, ephemera means half a day. Half a day, and 150 years later, it's still there. So I would like to pose that question as that something they collect today will still be there in 150 years for someone to look at.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the archive, please visit the University of Sheffield website at www.sheffield.ac.uk.